To me, harmonizes everything we just talked about, which is like, so input validation is a control we've relied on in software security for a long time. Harmonize it with the model, the prompt injection. I think that's a perfect example of what we mean by that. Now, another example would be serving infrastructure and the integrity of the serving infrastructure, just like you have an integrity of the deployment of your binaries.
You are listening to The Secure Developer, where we speak to leaders and experts about DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and much more. The podcast is part of the DevSecCon community, found on devseccon.com, where you can find incredible dev and security resources and discuss them with other smart and kind community members. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk's developer security platform helps developers build secure applications without slowing down, fixing vulnerabilities in code, open source containers, and infrastructure as code. To learn more, visit snyk.io/TSD.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Secure Developer. Thanks for tuning back in. Today, we're going to continue our AI security journey with Royal Hansen, who is a VP of Security and Privacy. He'll tell you more in a bit at Google and has been very deep in AI security for a little while now. So, Royal, thanks for coming on to the show.
Thanks for having me, Guy. It's great to be with you again and then with the audience.
Royal, tell us a little bit, give us a bit of context. I probably butchered precisely the title and scope of what you do. Tell us a bit about your role, maybe a little bit of context about your background for people to contextualize your advice as we go on.
Yeah, it's great. And as we've gotten to know each other, I think we share a fair amount of history, actually. I started my career at Stake in security. This is over 20 years ago. So deeply in this software security, web app security in the early days.
Yeah, a lot of great stuff came out of that world on it.
Exactly. Then I went to the banks. We did a lot of work for banks. So I worked in financial services, both in London and in New York. And that was because really, the cybersecurity issue was a big deal for the digitization of all of our financial services work. But 5 years ago, I came to Google, and really in many ways for conversations just like this. The platforms on which they were developing software, they were deploying enterprise software increasingly, and that consumerization of IT we talk a lot about. People beginning to use consumer IT in the context of enterprise. Just felt like being at a place like Google working on security was a great place to get leverage, right? To help more people. And so I came here 5 years ago. I run, you've got it right, privacy, safety, and security here, the engineering function centrally. And I think one element of it that's useful for the conversation here is that line between security and safety, particularly in the context of AI, is blurring. Yeah. And I think it's important that we all keep that in mind. It isn't just strictly speaking a technical arena that occasionally raises its head in the real world. Those lines have significantly blurred.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the safety and security, to an extent, there's also an element I was in the CISO of Meta here, and we talked about integrity and how
I would include the same.
And all these lines are so intermixed now. I guess as we get powerful and versatile systems like these sort of AI engines, AI brains that can do so many different things.
Exactly.
Yeah, it sounds a very compelling background and very valuable for security to see the different lenses. I do like the comment on the consumerization of IT, but also years ago, I had Adrian Ludwig here on the show. It was
a friend from that same era.
Exactly. He kind of became, and he talked about how in Google, he kind of developed an appreciation that enterprise grade security is actually like far worse security than consumer grade security, which in consumer grade, it means, it just needs to work. You can't expect people to go through training and sort of be taught like it needs to just work, which was a great kind of point of view that stayed with me through the years.
It's a really good point, and we'll talk about it. But I think this line between the cloud business at Google, which has grown, tremendously in the last 5 years, but yeah, you still do have these kind of two worlds of the consumer product and the enterprise, and they take a different business model, like a different way, but the tech heavily commingled in ways that I think if we do it well, everybody benefits. If we do it poorly, to your point, actually it's uneven. And I think people suffer from it, actually.
Yeah, and attackers find the lowest part, and they basically focus their energy on that. Let's sort of start. So we're going to talk a lot about the secure AI framework that you've released, and you're one of the authors of the blog and the paper on it, which I found to be a super interesting and today still one of the few AI security framework out there on it. And I'd love for us to go through it in detail. But before we do that, I'd love to just sort of get a few more loose form views from you about AI security. So I guess let me start with something very, very open-ended, which is, AI is an exciting but all super powerful technology that has kind of burst onto our lives in a somewhat alarming pace. What worries you most when you think about AI and security? Which concern most kind of alarms you?
Yeah, I think my primary concern, and there are lots of dimensions of risk that we're managing, and we'll talk about that, but is that we will throw out as a society the benefits of all of the investments, and this is how you and I know each other, in things like software security or data security or infrastructure security or safety, as we rush to adopt and include AI in all of these applications or infrastructure. So that's, the SAIF as a framework is designed to help us with that. But I think it points out that as an industry, as a society, we have this tendency to rush with a new thing. We got to be really thoughtful about the way we build off of existing strengths, because otherwise we'll open new vulnerabilities that have nothing to do with, frankly, the new AI-enabled interface, but we'll be on a shaky stack. We'll be on a new and uncertain stack. So I think you've heard Google talk about it, but I think it applies here. Being responsible and bold at the same time is the trick. We don't want to wait until we've figured everything out, because we'll miss all kinds of interesting opportunities.
You'd be secure.
On the flip side, if we lose those, 25 years of software security expertise, we're going backwards in a real way.
Sort of focus on the new and shiny instead of that's a really good point. I'd be remiss if I didn't explain a little bit that you and I, Royal, are both active members of the Open Source Security Foundation, the OpenSSF, and been very active on supply chain security, software supply chain security to be exact. And there's worlds of importance, and we could have 3 podcast conversations on that alone.
But that's a perfect example, just as a forecast a little bit of the SAFE thing is, as we've done software supply chain work and the security of it, now there will be new elements of the stack related to AI. Let's make sure we take a step forward in the provenance and the integrity of the AI configuration files, the models, or of the sort of whole supply chain of the data, in the context of something like SALSA or SBOM, the things that you would have talked about in this forum. Let's not make that a totally separate conversation. Let's make it one conversation. It's all software. It's all data.
And a lot of the fundamental concepts are security concepts where the tech can be swappable, but you still need to know where a component or data came from. You still need to be able to attest to something downstream, whether a certain process or controls have run through upstream. And so a lot of those fundamentals are alive and well.
Exactly. So you'll see people try, and I think new people will be involved here, to your point, who don't have that familiarity with the work on SALSA or SBOM work. We got to bring them along in this process. So that is part of the SAFE framework, which is, let's bring this AI community along on some of the journeys we've been on in the security world.
Yeah, and I think that's a good one. I think one challenge with that, when you look into getting the fundamentals of security into building an AI system, one concern that comes up is a lot of times the AI systems don't have fundamental development practices. There's a lot of data scientists, maybe to an extent data engineers, people in a variety of that continuum, and they're building systems oftentimes developing in production, oftentimes not versioning. Data is fairly poorly versioned in many of these use cases. I guess, can you, from a security team's lens, organizationally, clearly that's something that you can aim to improve and probably will help you in many more ways than security. But from a security lens, is that a prerequisite? Do you have to fight to get those dev practices or those deployment practices sorted out before you can really do what you need to security-wise? Or do you seek to lump on to that reality or security control?
It's a great point, and we could use it. We could talk about this at each layer of the either software development or sort of the model development lifecycle, or of the stack, right? They could take either lens. And one of the things that attracted me to Google 5 years ago, I knew from the outside, the team did an incredible job of integrating, just take the basic things like cross-site scripting or input validation literally into the mono repo so that we weren't testing every commit. We were simply scanning for the use of the correct input validation, script handling, output exfiltrate, output escaping, so that we knew people were using the right implementation. And so that saved an enormous amount of effort in the software security world because it was about using the correct thing, not finding all the versions of the bad that the tens of thousands of developers might submit. In this case, you're spot on. There's a whole new group of people who've been in research areas, working with data and iterating on models at frequencies that we've not seen in software, right? That just almost by definition, this tuning work is happening much faster. Yeah. And on the front end, think of the kind of the interface to a chatbot is natural language, not content handled by script, handled by code.
Right.
Literally,
a lot more loose form, a lot more
goes all the way to the model in a way. And then the model is deployed as a configuration file alongside your binary in the stack. For each one of those, I raised them just as different layers. To your point, the security team has been here working with the research and AI specialists to do exactly what we said. It's like, okay, this is new. It's different, the speed at which you're iterating. How do we sandbox that? Because we can't treat each iteration like a commit and a build. It's just not going to work.
Right. It's too big. It's too
big. It's too frequent. And the tools that's not the tools that they've been using. So how do you sandbox it so they can do that for a while without the risk sort of exploding into the rest of the ecosystem, but still give them the flexibility? Same thing with the config file that they deploy. How do you put the same kind of integrity controls on the config file that you have on the binary? Just treat it like a config file instead of treating it differently. Same thing on the front end. When it's a prompt, how do you treat that like code, like script, like almost like JavaScript that's being then sent into the model? So the point is the security team and the research team work together to build those. Think of it like crypto authorization input handling. We need our equivalent of the security primitives for the AI stack so no one ever has to think about these things.
I mean, that's great. There's a few prerequisites behind. First, you need to know who the researchers are, right? So that was another point.
Fair enough.
One sort of fellow CISO pointed out, which is a lot of security teams have been investing for years in a relationship with the development team, and they might have no relationship with the data science, data researchers. I guess they have to fix that. There's no two ways about it. You have to address that.
Well, I do think that's why the framework is actually a good one, because some of the framework, the SAIF framework, is just about bringing different communities together, the detection and response team, the automation. So it's not, because I do think you're right, the relationships and the confidence in each other is as important as some of the technical details.
Right. Great. So maybe I think we're sort of it's going to be very useful to go through the framework on it. But maybe let me ask you one more question before we go to the framework. We're going to talk a lot about structure and things you need to do. What excites you the most about AI and security?
Yeah, I think that AI is fundamentally a democratizing technology in that it's going to enable a lot of things that every individual already knows a fair amount about, but can't quite complete, right? They're not the expert in whether it's the SOC analyst, whether it's the software developer, but also just in the context of like normal life, whether it's my teenager who's doing, a variety of things with his phone.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of just these little things that if we were to go the last mile, the automation would be much, better. The efficiencies, the productivity gains will be enormous. Yeah. I think that's going to happen across the security landscape, but in lots of ways that are somewhat mundane, but the multiplier effect on that will be enormous. Think of all the people that are doing software, all the people that are doing scheduling, all the people that are doing logistics, all of this, every one of them is going to get a percentage better, and that multiplier will be enormous. So I think of AI through that lens rather than through sort of the whiz-bang sort of magic that it's going to solve. I think of it, semi-experts out there, they're going to get that much better.
Yeah, more the AI. You're more excited by the AI assistant than the autonomous
Correct.
system.
Correct.
It's more about making every person 100x more productive versus replacing certain roles. But although there is a role for, security talent shortage has been sort of a truism for many, many years. And, it's hard to get people onto that. So there are probably elements of the software world, of the security world, that we do want to aspire to have some amount of SOC analysis just be entirely autonomously done, which I guess is hard to really delineate between AI that has boosted an individual to do a lot of things and AI that has offloaded so much of their work that some aspect of their job is no longer their job. And now they're doing
That's right. It'll be different in every, line of work, every function, every person. And that's kind of what I like about it is it's flexible and can be applied to the person and their job.
Yeah.
And also requires the person to think about it a bit, like what's next in the list of tasks that we should get to.
And that excites you more than the concern around how much productivity boost the attacker is going to get? Like, do you feel in the balance? Because the attackers are going to get that, whatever, spear phishing at scale, like 1 million automated exploit generations as soon as a known vulnerability gets aired on it. I guess, do you feel industry-wise, community-wise, we're set up to have the defenders gain more of the value than the attackers?
Yeah, I'd love your reaction to this, but I've increasingly thought that when, just think of the asymmetry of most of, forget AI, but the way we've talked about it, you got that one attacker who's right once and defeats the 3,000 people doing security at a big company.
The fundamental bad equation of security.
Exactly. But in this case, that attacker is going to get incrementally better. But the 3,000 people are going to get equally incrementally better, each individual. The math here says defenders are going to get better more than an order of magnitude. I mean, when you think about the number of people doing defense versus offense, it's at least orders of, a couple of order of magnitudes different. So just if you think productivity and efficiency, effectiveness, automation, there's more on the one. Now, in each there will be plenty of one-off instances where the attackers benefit, but that's true today, right? That's not changing that.
For anything.
The math to me says defenders get better on faster here.
Yeah, that's an interesting. It's definitely an optimistic kind of view to it, and I think it's the one we should focus on. How do we make that happen?
That's right. Maybe there's something about my job that makes me think that way, but that's how I think.
No, and I think I'm not disagreeing with it. I think it's interesting. Maybe one counterpoint to that is if AI ends up inflating the attack surface the same way that it inflates productivity. Because if that happens, then that gain kind of goes away because defenders have that order of magnitude more systems to protect. And so we need to be cautious not to get ourselves into that reality.
I do think one of the big reasons that we've put so much energy into SAIF as a framework is that to your point, everyone's going to be affected by this because anyone who's got automation on the web, an app, any automated digitized service, whether they're doing AI or not, that interface could be enlisted an AI enhanced or enabled process. So the world's got to come along on this journey because you're right, those other interfaces, just because they're not AI enabled doesn't mean they might not be subjected to AI enabled activities. So we've got to do
intentional. Yeah.
That's right.
Good. Well, I think we teased the framework enough here. We should probably get going to describing it. So let's get to it. Maybe start off by just sort of telling us what is the SAIF framework about and start breaking it down. We'll kind of go through the different sections in detail.
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, at a highest level, and we've teased it out a little bit, it's simply the application of our own experience. When we began in 2011 with a team inside of security that was using that version of AI's capabilities to solve security problems. So, over 13 years, as that team has solved different problems or integrated with different foundational tech or thought about the attacker and the defender with that context, we've tried to distill in ways that are applicable not just to a large technology company or a software development company or a bank, but to anyone who wants to go down this journey, some categories of focus they could come along on this journey. So that's the first thing. The second is it's an effort for us together to refine each one of these, because as I said in the beginning, it's a lot of new stacks emerging, a lot of new players, a lot of new people, researchers, data scientists who've never been in the security conversation. And there's a journey to bring those folks along so that we as both companies, consumers and countries have confidence that there's a process and a structure for growing comfortable with each new innovation or each new implementation.
Yeah,
so
without needing
to
to
me,
replace the framework.
exactly. It's not as much about here's the plate, here's the recipe. It's about getting people together and working on each one with that combination of experts who can help us do it right. So you'll see a lot more detail over the coming quarters and years.
Got it. And that's the intent when it says that SAIF is a conceptual framework on paper. It's to say, and I guess maybe that's expectation setting as well as we talk here. And we'll talk about how to get to the specifics. The framework is quite high level.
Yes.
It is how you should think about the problem versus these are the 5 steps. There's some examples, of course, but it is conceptual. It is kind of high level how to think about it. So I guess let's sort of go through it. Maybe we start off by quickly enumerating. It has 6 components, right? Maybe we start off with that and then we start diving in.
Yeah. So, my sort of short list, poke at this or call out some element that that caught your eye in it. But the first step is the foundational work. And I sort of alluded to that, but just like the integration of the foundational work that we've already done in software security, in technology generally. The second is the integration or thinking of your detection response and your threat intelligence functions to integrate both the possibility of the attacker using AI, to our earlier conversation, as well as to then use it in defense, which is what leads to number 3, which is to use AI in automation to keep pace, really is what we just talked about, to make the defender or the defensive technology AI enabled as well. Fourth is to harmonize the controls. And so we talked about this in the context of now you've got Vertex AI or you've got TensorFlow or you've got other external frameworks. How do they integrate? How do the controls you use for input validation harmonize with what is now being used in that stack or in that component of the stack? Then the feedback loops, and we talked a little bit about this, but I think the speed at which models are iterated on and that AI-enabled software changes its behavior, you have to have a feedback loop in your own processes that expects that and doesn't kick off a 2-week sprint for each thing you learn. It's got to be much faster than that. And then the 6th is the contextualization, and we were just talking about this, that, again, these are all showing up in business processes, and maybe in some cases it's more fraud than it is security. But to take that step back and make sure you're thinking of it in the context of whether it's safety, integrity, fraud, whatever it is, the right framing.
As you evolve them. So I think the 6 steps, we'll get into it. They do blend a little bit into one another. And is it like, to me, they read as sorted. So like if you're only going to do one, do the first. If you're only going to do 2, do the first 2 on it. Is that correct? Like they feel like a maturity, do number 4 without doing number 1, but you can do number 1 without doing number 4.
Correct. And Manny, particularly as you go through those transitions, and you heard me a little bit as we went, one ought to lead to the next as you do it well. That's right.
Okay. So I think that's important because it represents, while it is a framework and it has the 6 elements, there's a facet of a maturity model in it as well. Although probably each of these is a never-ending task. You can always do more of each of the 6.
That's a great point. And that may be, that's a good example of where as a community, is that somewhere we want to go, right? Take this and maybe make it a little more granular under each so that we could more formally use the maturity model concept with it. So, again, good idea. We're looking for ideas here too, and how to best use this.
Yeah. And I think, maturity models have everybody has a bit of a love-hate relationship with them because you don't want to, they imply a certain point in which you're mature and you're done. And that's sort of not correct. But as you get started, I find ordering is very important for many people. They're just trying to figure out where to get started. So indeed, let's get started. Let's dig into the first one. So you explained or you touched on it several times here around the sort of the security fundamentals on it. I guess maybe carve that out. I understand that you need to not forget the basics in AI, but how, if you're attaching, this is your first step, you're trying to tackle, indeed, how do I identify even the foundations that I have? I guess, how do you approach embracing, like putting security foundations, the bare bones around AI?
Yeah. Look, so I think there's 2 levels to this. One, I talked a bit about when I went through the lineage of data and then the deployment with config files. But the very first step here is to our software supply chain work. What is the software that created and deployed in combination with whatever other software it's being deployed? in these applications. And so to me, there's just a knowledge of, with precision, the packages, the binaries, the code, however it's compiled, right? And this is the thing, they're very different. A model is just a model, has to be deployed in the context of some interface. It oftentimes will then interact with other pieces of software. So to me, the starting point is just knowing that. And as you said, sometimes these have grown up in silos outside of the traditional IT department. And so you don't know, right? So I think the first step is just people becoming familiar with the typical training and then deployment, serving, let's say, they have these serving platforms for models. And then as you look about, for your own databases, web, sort of logic tier and presentation layer, how do they fit together? And some of that's just technology, there's not magic. These are still just software data and, binaries that are deployed in a server with access to the internet.
Yeah, but it's simple but easy to forget, which is before you dive yourself into the world of prompt injection, try to figure out who is using what in the system, what components are in there, are they using any vulnerable components, what are the paths to production, the sort of the one-on-one of software security, not even.
That's right. And how are these being developed? Like what's the IDE, for your data scientist? Right. Yeah. So I think
stack, not just in the software, but also the stack in the software development process in the AI.
There's new tools, right? There are brand new tools, and not all of them, to our part of the conversation, have been integrated with the traditional pipelines of the software development teams.
Got it. Okay, so that makes sense. Now, maybe naturally because of Sneak a little bit, but I do hear about this a lot. For a lot of people, it starts from just like software supply chain security, hygiene. Just tell me, what is there? Does it have known vulnerabilities? We've had examples, MLflow being probably the most kind of noise-making one with a remote command execution vulnerability there, and then go on to that to just inventory and know to address. So you've inventoried, you've kind of, what you need to secure, which is a good start on it, and you know what's inside of them. Like, I guess, how do you evolve from there and from the basic security practice to the AI aspect to it? And notably, I guess I worry about data. I feel like people generally, it's a good reminder, but it's relatively easy for them to say, okay, remember that an AI system is the system still, and you need to secure the software around it. They have playbooks for that. They've done those roles for many years. The data piece is a lot more new, a lot more unknown to a lot of these people. Do you perceive it? Is it still, are there security foundations to data, or is that one of the later maturity phases?
Yeah, look, I think there's a practical reality in the beginning, which is just knowing the storage or databases that are used in the training. But by the time it's deployed in the context of the runtime of an application. Mm-hmm. That the history of the training. So I think there really are two dimensions to this. The training of a model, which then gets distilled and packaged. And then by the time it's deployed, I think it can be modeled very clearly like an input-output, and it's a configuration file in a serving layer of an application. And it can be disintermediated, right? So this is one of the things that we do with filters, right? There are different ways in which you can check the input before it gets to that model. So that's just one example of like
before it gets to the training of the model.
Yeah. Well, so I say that if I were worried about this as just a normal developer, seeing people begin to use it, I would focus on that runtime. And this is really the second point of the framework, which is detection and response and threat intel. To your point, if you understand at a high level, or at least the components, what is possible, right? So what are threat actors doing? What are my incident responders or the people monitoring the software? What should they be looking for? So it's kind of a threat modeling exercise.
Yeah. But before we go there, I get that. And I think it's both important and interesting. But before that, when we're still in the build phase, we're still in building a system, how do you consider, and how does the framework consider maybe the training phase, the ingestion of data? Is it runtime? Is it sort of a detect and respond type system over there if you've manipulated it?
To me, it's a
data poisoning attempts. If someone did, like, how do you do forensic? I think that's the scary bit around the build piece. Fine, once I have a file, if I trust the file, I can secure a file. But what do I need to think about ahead of it, earlier, upstream?
Yeah, and I think you have to distinguish between the foundational models and then the distillation and reinforcement learning that occurs on top. Because there's only a few companies on the planet that are going to be doing the foundational model training, right? So most people are going to pick up, some version of it, whether through an API or through a distilled model itself. So I think even in those cases, it becomes more of a runtime issue for most people than the true train. Like, at Google, we spend a lot of energy on the large amounts of data that are going into these models and making sure we know the kinds of risks that you're talking about. But that happens behind the scenes, to your point, not in a production environment in that sense.
Yeah, well, I guess I agree, but there are areas in between, like for instance, some people would run an open source model and they would, provide some additional training, or maybe the better way to think about it is the fine tuning exercise.
Yes, that's good. That's right.
Increasingly, if you are running a useful adaptation of the foundation model for your system, it probably involved some amount of fine-tuning, whether you embedded that into a context. I think that's maybe the 101, but oftentimes it's sort of more real tuning of. So I guess those pieces are, we're touching on the shared ownership model, right? Which is if you're just using, whatever, the Vertex API, right? Or whatever OpenAI, it's kind of like if you're just sort of picking a player and you're just calling the API and you just added some public context to it so that it would ingest your documents page and, give you some summaries, then your security concerns are quite light because there's nothing the AI system knows. It's not yours and it doesn't know anything that not everybody should know. But as you get into that fine tuning, I guess I perceived it in my less kind of educated, maybe sort of practiced version of this as something that is almost like a connected system, or like a system you build and run before as a training element, and you secure that, and then the output of that feeds into. Is that
No, you're right. There is an entire discipline which is similar to kind of the foundational model training in that middle that I think, your point, if this is the point, is prefigures the deployment to, publicly available, consumer available, whatever, user available serving of the model, which is whether you want to talk about it as fine tuning or reinforcement learning with humans or with, auto-generated. People are using models to generate content to train models or to distill, or the distillation process. And look, this is an area back to our safety conversation and sort of somewhere in the harmonize. I think we could have jumped to 4 in some ways to the harmonize.
That's what I was about to think is like maybe I'm drilling into something
totally fine,
like further down the maturity, which is good learning.
I think of that as 4. And my experience and why it's important to do this SAIF, the industry-wide, the experts here are the AI folk. It takes real understanding and hands-on experience to know how to do what you're just describing. And so I think this is where the security teams have to lock arms. And, the paper on this is related to our red team. Like we formalized our red team with 3 new researchers. They were not security people. They were just AI people, but hands-on with 3 of, sort of the team, just a small team to come together and say, let's work out the practices for red teaming. We know software security really well. We can break apps. We know model, the kind of work you're just describing. And let's use that expertise together. And I don't think there's any substitute at this point, because if, as you're saying, you have teams that are actually reinforcement learning or distilling models, like they're not just relying on an API, you really have to bring those 2 teams together because they're different. People have spent decades becoming good at reinforcement learning and distilling models, and people have been decades getting good at thinking about the kind of prompt and, the equivalent of prompt injection sort of attacks or what bad guys are going to do.
Yeah.
So I think if you're in that kind of business, you really have to dig in and understand what control can you get from the distilled model versus what control do you have to apply between the user interface and the served model. So to me, that's the big
I think that
question.
Makes a lot of sense. And I think it's a good clarification and actually very good guidance to someone that might be going down the rat hole I just did, thinking about securing the AI systems and say, okay, phase 1, there's software here. So just clean it up, know what's there, do your software supply chain security practices, adapt them, understand, make sure that you cover the AI stacks and that you're able to secure those. There's really, to an extent, nothing terribly novel at this phase about it being AI or not being AI. It is a bunch of assets that you need to secure and you need to run them through it. And then it leads you, and then after that, instead of going down and make sure you go on and route the ad, sort of the refining of your model, step 2 is actually the runtime piece. Maybe we switched to talking a lot about that. So how, like you've already touched on it a little bit, but how do you define kind of that step 2?
Yeah, so for me, the primary lens in step 2 is the detection and response and threat intelligence, because everybody's coming on this journey to really understand some of the nuances we just talked about. But in the short term, what you need to know is, what are bad guys doing, either using AI against your interfaces, back to the conversation we had earlier, maybe completely unrelated to AI. It's just your web service, your API. Or in the instance where you're combining some new models and software, like we talked about in phase 1, what are the abuse vectors? And so to me, there's just a familiarity with reality in the same way we talked about with software, and the red teaming or the adversarial testing or the detection and response, that they're learning that's to me the front line after you know what's deployed.
Yeah.
Even before we get to kind of the sophistication of harmonizing the controls.
Yeah. So phase 1, I feel if I'm a CISO, I'm kind of getting those marching orders. I know how to execute. Phase 2, some of the stuff you mentioned are, familiarize myself with AI attack vectors, doing a runtime detecting on prompt injection. I guess, is that practical for me? Like, how, given the nascent nature of tooling in the ecosystem at the moment?
Yeah, I think so. One, there is more and more, threat intelligence and writing on this. So I don't think everybody needs to go to the same level of school in it. But I do think that means, to the degree your detection and response to your SOC team and to the degree you have a threat intelligence team, or you're consuming it from others, it needs to be a line of thinking and study,
right?
Not just for the phase 2, but for phase 3 when you want to use it. So to me, that's why 2 becomes 3, which is then you want your teams to use it. So I think the SOC is actually one of the best places that we're going to find productivity and enablement. And so then you see what we're doing in Google Cloud. One of the things with the Chronicle suite and others is to start getting the SOC superpowered with more of these capabilities. They're a perfect candidate for an interface where they can ask questions. Think about how hunting happens right now, or response. Oftentimes it's a lot of different screens and a lot of different places. To me, the opportunity is that SOC analyst or the team running that, or the detection response functions, as they become familiar with it, one of the best ways to become familiar with it is to use it, to begin to think about how you could use the simplest of automations to understand it better. So, because you're right, there's no magic bullet. It's a journey that these teams are going to go on. But again, most people are not immediately deploying a distilled and reinforced, sort of refined model into their
that touches sensitive data that is accessible to the attackers. But I guess that's the other signal to take out of this is if you reach step 2 and you say, I don't know how to do this, then maybe that should give you pause a little bit about which systems you're willing to deploy to production in terms
that's
of
fair. That's a fair.
But we touched on 2 and 3 here. So sort of phase 2 is to say, look, know what's going on in runtime. Some complexity in the ecosystem today around the tooling able to detect it. We'll come back a little bit to prompt injection because I think there's some interesting nuance to it. But then step 3 is more about using AI for security. And the framework in yourself, you're mentioning there's reciprocity between those 2 elements, if nothing else, just by familiarity with the subject matter.
That's it. And, that's why I feel like we had a leg up in a way that wasn't necessarily by design, but because we had a team that had been using it for almost 15 years.
We knew what to look for. Yeah.
We knew how to start engaging, even if the SOC teams hadn't spent all their time thinking about it. Once this emerged, we had a body of expertise that could be, or team that had hands-on experience.
Right.
But even still, it's our SOC that's using the kind of simplest of chatbot interfaces in an appropriate way here to automate their own jobs, to help them be faster, for the very reason that I'm describing, which is so they're better and smarter on this stuff, in addition to the productivity gains they get.
So I think a bit of a side question about prompt injection. So I had David Hatter from Lakera on here that created Gandalf, kind of talking about prompt injection. And I took 2 interesting things out of it. One is sort of the thinking of the LLM system or the foundational model as kind of like the brain. And so you can train it to your heart's content and you can make it do the right thing more often, but you can never really fully assure that it won't the wrong thing or say the wrong thing. And therefore, you have to anticipate a wrapper around it. And then the second related, and I guess that was sort of a little bit less from this conversation, is that prompt injection feels a lot less like a problem that you can fully solve than SQL injection or even elements of remote command execution, where they feel there's a finite set of correct answers that you can reduce it to, versus, this attempt at social engineering, the LLM of sorts, that is maybe more akin to phishing and is something that you should anticipate that will never go away, that you can't build a system that is sufficiently resilient that it would make the runtime system kind of useless. Is that correct? Like, am I wrong about either of those?
I think that's a logical way of thinking about it. And I admit to thinking roughly in the same way. But I'm not yet, because all of us are going on this journey. Rick, I did, a very basic AI, sort of nearest neighbor type clustering senior thesis in college. But I'm still coming along on some of the, the nuanced journeys, because I've been a security person, I've been a privacy person. And I'm just like think of JavaScript or think of buffer overflows and think of some of that gets managed in hardware. We're still working on memory tagging in hardware, or we're working in JavaScript on the front end, where you do provide a convenience of checking the input in the browser, even if you don't rely on it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's better to think of it as a composite set, and you use the best tool for in the layer. I'm still excited about some of the reinforcement learning work that we can do. We're still very early on in training the brain like you're describing. I agree with you. It doesn't mean we'll ever rely on it solely. You want that pre-submission and ultimately post-submission, because the other part of it is almost independently of whether you fooled anyone or not. What action is it going to take?
Yeah.
And that's where the risk occurs, whether that's to automation or to individuals. So I think you work at all layers, and I think a really fruitful area of research is combining security, safety, and AI expertise in the distillation and reinforcement learning of these models to get them as good as we can in the context you described, because the filtering on the front end or back end has its own limitations. So I think you've got to keep working on all of them. We're just more familiar as security people of the software, the sort of regex type checking versus the reinforcement learning, which is a new domain. But I think you're going to, if I were,
we're used to systems that, behave the same way when told the same way. We're not used to ever evolving, ever changing systems.
Exactly.
And somehow still able to assess whether they're right or wrong. If
I were 22 years old, like in listening to this and said I wanted to sort of think about my career, I would go headlong into this sort of like, how are we going to make these multimodal models as safe and smart as we can using the tools themselves?
Yeah.
I think that's fruitful. A lot of research and a lot of interesting work still to do. And really a big part of why we're doing the SAIF work is to bring the whole community along in that discussion.
Yeah, indeed. So I think let's maybe go through, I think we're sort of running a little bit short on time, but it's okay, because I think the first steps are more the meaty ones and they lead into it. So, all in all, I think if you're sort of at phase 3, you should be pretty pleased with yourself at that point, right? You've established the foundations on it. You have some runtime protection. You're using AI to secure your AI interaction, and hopefully more than that, the plain interactions as well. Now you get to the harmonized phase. So we've already alluded to.
We're kind of just talking
about that quickly, and then we talk about the next one.
To me, harmonizes everything we just talked about, which is like, so input validation is a control we've relied on in software security for a long time. Harmonize it with the model, prompt injection. I think that's a perfect example of what we mean by that. Now, another example would be serving infrastructure and the integrity of the serving infrastructure. Just like you have an integrity of the deployment of your binaries, you want the same to apply to the model weights in the serving infrastructure. So you have integrity of that to deployment, as well as in runtime, that it can't be tampered with or stolen. So to me, each of these software security domains, now you look and say, okay, what have I picked up, or what's new? What's the implementation of input validation or integrity of deployment or output escaping in the context of this new app? And you harmonize. Yeah.
And so that's like the level up of the previous, like when you're getting going, just like put something in place, and it's probably going to be orthogonal to your, like it should be the same practices. You should use your learning. Sometimes you use the same tools, but you should use the right tools for these build time, run time, text and respond times for AI. Step 4 is really around an appreciation that at the end of the day, you're not looking to protect AI, you're looking to protect your business. And that would include AI components and not AI components. And you should strive for uniform handling of these things, right?
That's right.
So people don't need to rationalize about two different approaches.
That's right. And, don't treat AI and the software as isolated controls. You got to think about the flow of data.
And the attackers want. Okay, cool. So we talked about harmonize. We're at step 5 here now. Again, we're sort of getting into expertise domain. If you were to think of it as maturity, which is not exactly correct, but which is adapting controls to adjust mitigations to create faster feedback loops for AI deployment. So what is it?
This is super exciting, right? But we've always talked, even years ago, I think at AtStake, we talked about self-defending applications. But you have to think about these systems, or potentially think about them, it depends on the system, as reacting almost in real time to the environment, to the attack, to the, and this isn't just security, this is quality.
Right.
And so, it also includes things like the training, and the way software is developed and deployed. You got to do these things quickly. So I think macro level, we stop thinking of this as just a build pipeline and thinking of it as a little more living system.
Mm-hmm.
And we're almost constantly tuning or responding, sometimes using the system itself because you've trained it to respond to certain prompts in one way or input. And sometimes because the teams behind it, this is the back to detection and response and others, are literally an extension of the system because they're receiving alerts, they're receiving escalations, they're receiving exceptions. And to me, that's, there's lots more work to do, but, the red team is a good example. You're running red team exercises yourself against this in ways that, that's not a one-time thing. It's almost a constant
harden the defenses. It's an exciting idea indeed if we get there. Basically, by successfully hacking the system and then telling the systems, hey, I've hacked you, the system would rearrange itself to prevent that hack from happening again.
So the real example for us is in a lot of the safety work. You have humans that are evaluating the spectrum of harm, and then it includes malware and phishing and things like that. But instead of those analysts then tuning their classifiers through a process, ideally, their feedback literally tunes the model in real time.
Yeah.
And there's nothing that prevents that from happening. That's what the system does.
Yeah. So the simple versions of that have been happening with like IP reputation, or there's elements of accumulating signal that are happening in the world of security and happening for a while. This is just a lot more evolved than that.
Well, when you have
in most cases, this would be something that you would look to purchase a tool. No, like I wouldn't expect every whatever sort of online business to evolve their own defenses. They would use tools that do this type of learning.
Yeah, just like you would have in a call center or a support center, you're going to keep buying a better interface for those analysts on the front line. The same thing will happen for the SOC. I agree.
Yeah.
But again, it does depend a little bit on the familiarity of those teams with the technology to do it well. I think
because it is quite a mind bend exercise for you, the inconsistency. There's a whole topic here we're not going to open up around how we as a society deal with statistical systems. And if we only let go, they can do so much for us. But we're used to systems being aspirationally deterministic. So let's talk about sort of the black belt phase there. Contextualize AI systems risk in surrounding business processes, which again, I don't know if I'm abusing the maturity analogy on it, but it does feel advanced.
Yeah. And I think, again, this is the opportunity that AI is presenting as we automate more and more or we digitize more and more of society. Through all of the things we've talked about, remember that we're not in it just for intellectual satisfaction that the system is correct. We're in it to protect consumers' deposits. We're in it to protect consumers' health. We're in it to protect travelers, right? So you have to think much more holistically, and you need to involve the trust and safety teams, the fraud risk teams. Everybody needs to be thinking of it as a bigger system. And so again, back to SAIF as a framework, it's to bring society along. I actually think for all the sort of interesting technical work that we've just talked about, the important part of responsible here is to bring society along on this journey. This is not like the majority of the users of these chat bots or interfaces are not software people, but all of a sudden they've kind of become software people, right? Because they're interacting in a way that's much more automated with these systems. So to me, we got to bring the larger community along on this journey.
Yeah, the rest of the business. And it's interesting. It's not the same as citizen developers that are building applications, but it is more active participation in them modifying the system. Yeah. And I guess interestingly, to an extent, this is the job of security, is to make the decision around whether the risk is worth the reward in different actions that run across the system. Should I block this user from making this purchase, losing money in the process because I think it's fraud? That's probably the most clear representation of it, but we evolved that. Okay, good. I think, thanks, Royal, for sort of walking through it. I think the framework is very powerful. Just from my 2 cents, it does feel very much like a maturity model for it, because it feels you can't really jump to 5 or 6. You have to have laid the foundations in them, although, of course, all of them evolve all along. I think we've got about 5 more minutes here. I'd like to maybe try to squeeze in 2 questions here. And as we evolve, we go past the framework and we get into the practicality of it. Like, people will do it. Let's say, they listened here, they read the paper, they love it, they come along. A lot of these phases are quite theoretical and people might need a bit more hand-holding. You alluded to the sort of the red team document on it, but what should we expect from the SAIF framework in terms of, maybe more handheld guidance for today?
Yeah, on each one of these, we are working on the next layer of technical and procedural, or even sort of just pointers to help expand that. So they should look for that. But we're also engaging a number of companies, partners. You've seen us with the public sector, different countries, thinking about how to make commitments, do these things responsibly together. So it won't be just from Google, it'll be from others. If we do this well, they'll be contributing to that same framework.
Yeah, and do you think this might be a foundation for regulation, for instance? Like, as you designed it, you thought of it as something that might serve that type of purpose as well?
I think that it's a contribution to the discussion. How regulation unfolds in each country is a sort of work in progress for both the industry and the country. And we hope that it's useful in that context.
Yeah, and I guess the longevity or the design of it to have longevity aligns with that purpose of it.
That's right. You don't want to, let's not freeze ourselves in any one moment of time here, because there's still a lot of responsibility going with the boldness at this point.
Super helpful. I appreciate you and Google releasing the framework for it on it. I do think people need help with kind of rationalizing where it is. I'm sure as we learn more on it, there's going to be some evolutions of it. Hopefully they're not dramatic, but indeed bringing in more than a decade of experience from within Google is very valuable. Hey, Royal, before we close off here, maybe one last question to ask you. If you could use AI to automate away one aspect of your job, what part would that be?
I'm actually very excited about the personal assistant elements, just the little things in my life, whether personal or other, that just take a little bit too long, a little bit too many emails, or a little bit too many web forms. I am very excited just to take some time back for myself in those little things. So I'm quite excited about that, actually.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I've actually heard someone toying with building a phishing disparaging type system where it would answer a phishing email and it would go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. When you spot a phishing email, you click a button and it would respond, which I thought was very entertaining.
That is entertaining.
Positive, a more effective version of that, not for the phishing, for the.
That's right.
That sounds like a good one. I would love one of those as well. Royal, thanks again for tuning in here, and looking forward to seeing SAIF evolve.
Great. We're looking forward to it. Maybe we'll come back with a deeper dive on one of those as we have some more material with the industry. That'd be great.
Absolutely. That would be great. And thanks everybody for tuning in, and I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks, Guy.
Thank you for listening to The Secure Developer. You will find other episodes and full transcripts on devseccon.com. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and don't forget to leave us a review on Apple iTunes or Spotify, and share the episode with others who may enjoy it and gain value from it. If you would like to recommend a guest or topic, or share some feedback, you can find us on Twitter at DevSecCon and LinkedIn at The Secure Developer. See you in the next episode.